Hi, sorry about that. So I was just saying, sorry if I seem a bit tired. And apparently tired enough not to unmute myself, even though it's late for many of you. It's actually very early in Los Angeles. So today I'll be talking about globalization and child labor. And so this this project is really motivated by substantial controversy about the costs and benefits of foreign capital liberalization in India. So foreign capital liberalization is a large-scale globalization policy that facilitated flows of foreign capital into domestic firms in India. And on the one hand, we might expect that this policy could have very positive effects because it's increasing Indian firms' ability to access capital, and so it could unlock economic growth. On the other hand, these reforms have often been criticized as anti-poor, and different commentators have suggested that they've had negative distributional consequences. And so if we think that these may have actually hurt the poorest of the poor, this could have very bad effects on the children of the poorest of the poor. And so in particular, when we think about child labor, the effects of globalization can be very ambiguous. And here I'm actually going to reference a lot of Eric's different papers. And so on the one hand, if globalization increases inequality and poverty, so if globalization is anti-poor, as suggested by Rajan and de Bourgeois, then this could lead to an increase in the reliance on child labor because as families fall into poverty, they need to use child labor to help get a subsistence standard of living. On the other hand, if globalization is helping to unlock economic growth, it's increasing incomes, then that could reduce the reliance on child labor and increase human capital investment. And in addition to these two kind of conflicting potential income effects, there's also, we can think of as an opportunity cost effect. If globalization helps create new low-skilled job opportunities, and in fact increases the wages associated with low-skilled jobs, then it's going to increase the opportunity cost of schooling. And so we might see that children are going to invest less in their human capital and instead take these low-skilled job opportunities. And there was some work by Dave Atkin in Mexico that suggests that's the case. And so in this project, we're going to exploit the fact that India liberalized access to foreign capital in different, fairly disaggregated industries at different times. For those of you who are familiar with industry coding in India, they're going to be doing this at the 5-digit level, which is a very fine industry level. And we can combine the timing of these reforms with information on the ex-ante share of employment in an industry in a district from the Indian census to look at which districts should be most affected by these reforms and see how the outcomes of those districts changed after the reforms relative to districts that we would expect to be less affected. And so this is what we often call a local labor market approach, where we compare two labor markets, one that we expect to be more exposed to another labor market that we expect to be less exposed. And what's going to be really nice about the specific reforms that we study is they're going to affect both the manufacturing and service sectors. And it might well be the case that these could have different effects. So we often think about the service sector as more female-oriented, so this could affect women more. We often think that service sector jobs could be higher human capital, while manufacturing sector jobs could be lower human capital. And so we want to also disentangle the effects of these different types of globalization as opposed to just combining them and looking at them together. So let me tell you a bit about this context for those of you who might not know that much about India. So after India's independence, it was initially a closed socialist economy. And foreign investment was very heavily regulated under something called the Foreign Exchange Regulation Act. Under this act, any individual foreign investment required government approval. And foreign ownership was restricted to below 40%. So there was two obstacles that were keeping foreign investment out. One was that there was a cumbersome regulatory process, which made it difficult to make those investments. And another was just the fact that you couldn't have too much foreign investment in a specific domestic firm. In 1991, India suffers a major macroeconomic crisis, And this leads to a series of structural reforms in partnership with the IMF and the World Bank. A lot of things happened in 1991 at the same time. So we get a lot of capital liberalization, which is the focus of this paper. And this is kind of the first wave of capital liberalization that happens in India. It's going to affect about almost 50% of the manufacturing sector. But at the same time of this capital liberalization, we're also going to have this macroeconomic shock. And we're also going to have other reforms such as trade liberalization, which has been studied elsewhere. And in fact, even the effects of trade liberalization on child labor have been studied. And that's going to reduce tariff barriers. And there's also going to be the dismantling of something called the license barrage, which affected where different establishments could locate. And so both because there's not a lot of data from this period, and also because you're going to have so much happening at the same time, we're actually going to focus on a later set of reforms that are typically going to be smaller. And so we're going to look at reforms that happened in the late 1990s and early 2000s. And so to track down information on these reforms, we collected data on FDI liberalizations at the 5-digit industry level from the Indian Handbook of Industrial Policy and Statistics, which is released approximately every year by the Indian government and keeps track of which reforms are put in place each year. In the case of manufacturing, this is going to lead to us studying substantially smaller liberalizations than that big 1991 reform. The subsequent liberalizations we study do affect important industries like pharmaceuticals, but they're only going to account for about 10% of manufacturing firms. In the case of service sector, actually, this is not going to be a small set of reforms. Cumulatively, these reforms are going to account for about 63% of the service sector. But because this is going to be taking place over time, you're not going to have one specific year where there's a massive shock that reforms most of the industry. And under these reforms, you're going to get the cap on foreign equity raised to at least 51% and sometimes higher. So remember that previously was set to 40%. So this is a pretty significant increase in the amount of foreign equity you can have in a domestic form. And that equity is now going to be approved via an automatic approval route. So you're not going to have a government ministry individually approve every foreign investment. And so that's going to be a lot less cumbersome. And so just to make the point to you that these reforms actually had a big effect on capital flows, this is a plot just plotting the effect of being in a treated industry on log capital for a firm around the time of the reform, where the reform happens in year one, or, so this is central so that for lots of different reforms, so reforms always happen in year one. And you can see that in treated industries, there's no differential time trends in capital prior to the reform. Capital's evolving in exactly the same way as in untreated industries. But after a reform happens in a treated industry, we see that capital steadily increases and becomes permanently higher, about 40 to 50% higher. And so this is very consistent with the fact that these reforms had bite. They actually affected the economic situation in India. And so it's worth trying to understand how they're going to affect the situation for children. And so for our local labor market approach, we're going to generate two measures, one that are at the district year level, one that's going to capture the intensity of the effect of the reforms on manufacturing in a district, and one that's going to capture the intensity of the effect on services. And so essentially what we're going to do is we're going to look at the share of employment in the 1990 census in each disaggregated industry within a district. And we're going to basically just say that that turns on once that industry gets liberalized. So you're going to say, what share of 1990 employment is in industries that have been liberalized by EOT? And we're going to calculate that separately for manufacturing and services. Okay, and so it's going to turn out that this is going to give us a lot of variation in the exposure to the reforms. And so here I'm showing you on this map two different measures of this intensity manufacturing variable in 2011, which is going to be the last year that we have data. And so that's going to be at the point where we have as many reforms happening as we're going to be able to see. And so you can see that in terms of continuous exposure, you're going to run the gamut from districts that are going to have 0% exposure all the way to 10% exposure. You can also see that these districts are not really concentrated in any particular part of the country. There's wide geographical variation in how exposed different districts are. And so it's not going to be too much of a concern that we're just maybe comparing the north to the south, or some part of India that's very different to some other part of India that's very different. For simplicity for today, instead of looking at the continuous exposure, we're actually going to look at a measure of exposure that just says, did you move to be above median treated? So was your level of exposure above the median level of exposure? And so this graph, instead of just plotting all that continuous variation, is going to show the above and below median measures. And again, what you can see is that this is incredibly geographically variant. It's really not going to be concentrated in any specific regions in India. We can do the same exercise with the service sector liberalization. Because the service sector is bigger than manufacturing in India, and also because the liberalizations were larger, we're actually going to see levels of employment exposed going up even to 15%, so a little bit higher than we saw in manufacturing. But again, we're going to have the case that when we look at the continuous measure, and also when we look at the above median measure, the treated districts are very geographically distributed. They're not really all going to be clustering in the same place. You're not going to look at them and say, oh, all of our treated districts are in the north, or all of our treated districts are in the south. Okay, so far I've told you a bit about the sort of explanatory variable treatment that we're going to be studying. Now I want to tell you a bit about our outcomes data. And so we're going to combine this with data from the Indian National Social Sample, Schedules 1 and 10. For those of you who don't know about this data set, it's a really interesting data set because it's a large sample of households on the order of about 100,000 households. It's one in not quite every district in India, but almost every district. In recent years, it's been one kind of every couple of years. And so this is going to mean that we are going to be able to look at how outcomes are changing over time in these districts over a pretty long period from 1994. And we look at start in 1994 in part because that's a little bit after that 1991 shock where so many different things were happening. So we can look from 1994 to 2011, so a period of about almost more than 15 years. Now, one of the things that's really nice about this national social sample is that it asks a primary activity status question for every household member, and not just adults. So it's also going to ask what a child's primary activity is. And so for today, we're going to look at the effect of the reforms on whether a child's primary activity is being enrolled in school. And so I also just want to highlight that while this is amazing data, it's actually pretty hard to work with because during this period, India did a lot of decentralization. And so what that means is that lots of districts got split up into multiple districts, or like bits of one district got added to a bit of another district to form a new district. And so when you get these sort of cross-sectional data sets, it's not actually straightforward to combine them into a panel. And so one of the things that we're going to do, which is hopefully going to be that we've done, which is hopefully going to be a public good for the community, is that we're going to harmonize all the districts to 1994 boundaries so that this data actually can be used as a district level panel over this 15-year period. And so that's something that we're going to eventually make publicly available and well documented. Okay, so in the last part of the talk, I want to actually show you some results. And I just want to say that all of this is preliminary. We're still very much working on this project. And essentially what we're going to do is we're going to estimate something called event study graphs. And so the idea here is we're going to regress an indicator variable for whether a child is in school on a set of indicator variables that are going to be for like 1 year after a district became an above median exposed district, 2 years after a district became an above median exposed district, 3 years, and so on. And we'll do the same for 1 year before, 2 years before, and so on. We're going to control for district fixed effects to account for anything about districts that's time invariant. And we're going to control for yield fixed effects to account for any macroeconomic shocks that are happening in India over time and might affect all districts in the same way. And so the real intuition here is that we're going to be looking at a district that becomes an above median exposure district for services or manufacturing, and see how the outcomes change in terms of children attending school over time relative to a district that doesn't switch into being above median services or manufacturing. And so the reason we're going to focus on above median for them now is, and this is a little bit technical, is there's been a lot of issues raised in the two-way fixed effects or difference in differences literature in economics about using continuous treatment variables. And so this is going to let us be more robust to concerns in that literature. Okay, and so here we're plotting our results for manufacturing, where we're plotting the coefficient for the effect on a child being enrolled in school as their primary activity, and in the years around the reform. And here's, this is going to be centered so that 0 is the first year of the reform. You can see that prior to a reform taking place, schooling is evolving pretty much in the same way in treated or highly exposed and less exposed districts. And this is consistent with what we call the parallel trends assumption in economics. It provides us with confidence that we don't have emitted variable bias driving our results. Following the reform, we see that there's a decline in children's schooling in places that became more above median exposed in manufacturing. And actually, by 5 years out, kids are about 4 percentage points less likely to report schooling as their primary activity in a place that had an above median manufacturing exposure. Now, ex ante, it wasn't obvious to us that manufacturing and services would have the same effects, because remember that manufacturing we might think of as creating higher opportunity costs for schooling. Services might be different. It might actually increase the returns to schooling if service sector jobs will require a high rate of education. And so here we're going to look at the effect on services, and actually, somewhat to our surprise, we see something pretty similar, albeit less strong. So again, we don't see any evidence that schooling is evolving in different ways in above median service sector districts prior to the reform. But after the reform, we see evidence that children's likelihood of being enrolled in school is dropping by about 2 percentage points. So again, there seems to be some evidence that education is falling as a result of these reforms. Where does this leave us? Well, on the one hand, these are consistent. Both of these effects are consistent with the idea that liberalization reduced education. In the case of manufacturing, we're seeing effects on the order of 2 to 4 percentage points. These are not tiny effects. In the case of services, we're seeing effects on the order of 2 percentage points. And so on the face of it, this seems like it could be consistent with either one of two potential mechanisms that I discussed at the beginning of the talk. It could be consistent with the idea that the reforms increased poverty and therefore more children have to engage in work because of these distributional effects of reform. It could also be consistent with the idea that these reforms created more jobs that kids could be engaged in, and so it actually increased the opportunity costs of schooling and therefore reduced education. That said, like I said before, these results are very preliminary, and I really want you to interpret them with caution. One of the reasons I want you to interpret them with caution is that it's very possible that the policy affected in-migration. So it could be that when a district is exposed, now there's lots of new jobs available and new households migrate into the district. And so if poor households who are less likely to have their kids in school are migrating into these districts, we could see what looks like education falling, but it's really just a compositional effect where the population of the districts changed. And in fact, in the NSS, in several of the rounds, we actually can look at in-migration. And we do see evidence that these reforms also increased in-migration. And so we think it's very important before we draw strong conclusions to really disentangle the effects of in-migration from the effects on the education of the kids who already lived in the district. And so we think, our next steps are to ensure that these results are robust. Some of that has to do with simple technical robustness tests, like adding additional controls and methods from the growing two-way fixed effects literature. But some of that also has to do with really trying to understand if these effects are compositional and driven by in-migrants, as opposed to whether the real causal effects on kids who already lived in the district. We also think that if this is a negative effect, in fact, isn't driven by migration and is a real result, then it's also really important to assess the role of poverty. Is it because these reforms are having negative distributional effects versus the role of opportunity cost mechanisms? Because these have very different implications, both for what kind of policies you would want to address this decline in schooling, and also for the welfare of households. If people are engaging in these opportunities because the opportunity cost of schooling has gone up, well, we still might think that's bad for education. That's at least perhaps less bad for household welfare than if they're being forced to engage in child labor or not attending school because poverty has increased. And so that's all to say that I think we have some really interesting initial results, but a lot more work is needed to really understand what's happening in this really interesting reform period. And I will stop there, and hopefully I haven't run too much over time. Thank you.